They thought it was just a drill, until their world burned. The announcement crackled through the speakers of over 40 systems, broadcast in flawless standard galactic. Today, we test our elite against relics of the past. Humanity, the extinct predator species, will serve as our live targets. Applause followed. Galnet forums exploded with excitement. Billions watched, assuming it was just another simulation, just another military exercise to validate the superiority of the Galactic Alliance forces, another opportunity to remind the galaxy of how the humans had fallen. Commander Vectal stood before his assembled troops, his posture proud, his tone dripping with condescension. "Remember," he told them, "you're not here to kill. You're here to evaluate your combat awareness against organic unpredictability. The humans are unarmed, no threat. Observe, adapt, subdue." The station where the exercise was to take place floated in the dead orbit of a forgotten red dwarf. Cold metal corridors, flickering lights, and echoing footsteps defined its character. It had once been a listening post during the human conflict era, but had long since been decommissioned. The irony of using it for this simulation was not lost on Vectal. 33 humans were brought in, thin, scarred, and silent, shackled and escorted by armed guards. None of them spoke. No begging, no questions, just silence and eyes that watched everything. The soldiers laughed. "They look like animals," one said. "Is this supposed to be a challenge?" Among them stood Callan Reich. He was taller than most, gaunt but sinewy. His gaze never wandered. His hands never trembled. While the others were herded toward their designated zones within the simulation area, Callan moved with deliberate calculation. He had counted every step, every guard, every vent and camera. They thought he was just another relic, but he had waited years for this. Galactic civilians tuned in for entertainment. Young cadets watched, hoping to study tactics. Politicians prepared statements praising the Alliance's continued commitment to security. Meanwhile, deep within the simulated urban zone, Callan knelt in a dark corner, his fingers tracing the edges of rusted panels and loose bolts. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. No one suspected anything. 7, 6. The aliens secured their gear. 5, 4. Cameras went live. 3, 2, 1. Simulation start, alien soldiers fanned out through the compound in perfect formation, their visors adjusted automatically, tagging heat signatures and outlining their unarmed targets. Non-lethal rounds were chambered. Drones hovered silently. The whole thing was being streamed from dozens of angles. Then something unexpected happened. A patrol reported static interference in their comms. Another complained of sudden motion blur on their HUDs. Then silence. One squad disappeared off the map. Not dead, not wounded, just gone. Vectal ordered a recalibration of the system. Glitches were not uncommon. But then the first feed went black, and the next. Then a scream, brief, sharp, real, echoed through the corridors before cutting out. A technician froze. "Commander, we're picking up unauthorized movement. Multiple human targets, coordinated. That's impossible," Vectal barked. "They were unarmed." The technician stammered. "They were, but something's wrong." A new feed came online. From one of the drones. It showed a human crouched over an alien corpse, hands soaked in blue blood. The body was limp, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Another human appeared behind him, holding what looked like a pipe. No, a sharpened fragment of rebar, dripping. Vectal stared at the feed, unable to comprehend. This wasn't training. This wasn't a drill. It was a massacre in the making. Within 5 minutes, 6 patrols were wiped out. The station's internal sensors were being jammed, doors sealed and reopened at random. Ventilation shafts carried figures that moved faster than the cameras could track. The humans had not fled. They had spread. Callan Reich was at the center of it all. Every move he made was surgical. Every strike had purpose. Every target he eliminated had been part of a greater calculation. He remembered the stories passed down through the hidden generations about how the galaxy had declared humanity too dangerous, too unstable. How Earth had been rendered uninhabitable by orbital bombardments and atmospheric sterilizers. But Earth had not died. It had gone silent. They had thought silence meant extinction, but silence was just the beginning. The human survivors who had escaped the cleansing learned to adapt, to hide, to manipulate systems far beyond their means. They infiltrated old tech, built enclaves in forgotten ruins, and trained for the day they would be remembered, not as victims, but as vengeance. Now, that day had come. Callan reached a maintenance junction and opened a comms port. Static. He adjusted the signal manually, bypassing outdated encryption protocols. Soon his voice echoed through the command deck speakers. "This was never your drill," he said coldly. "This is your sentence." Panic spread. Vectal shouted for containment teams, but none responded. A second feed appeared. Another squad, elite troopers, had cornered a group of humans. The aliens approached confidently. Then one tripped a wire. The explosion tore the corridor in half. Bodies spun in zero gravity, shredded by debris. A lone human walked through the chaos, unflinching. The station descended into chaos, and the galaxy watched, speechless. On worlds far removed from the event, spectators leaned in closer. What had begun as a training exercise was now turning into something darker. Alien commentators stuttered. Analysts scrambled to explain. Some thought it was a simulation within a simulation, but the blood was real, and the fear? That was unmistakable. Back in the control center, Vectal gripped the edge of the console, knuckles pale. They were supposed to be extinct. Callan's voice returned, distorted but clear. "You should have left us that way." The first alien corpse was discovered slumped against a corridor wall, throat torn open with something jagged. No weapon found, no signs of struggle, just a smear of blue blood trailing off into the darkness. At first, the observers assumed it was a malfunction in the simulation's biofeedback system. Non-lethal rounds were standard protocol. No one was supposed to die. But the second body erased all doubt. Its exosuit breached, chest cavity crushed inward with terrifying precision. Internal organs pulverized. Death was instant and intentional. Commander Vectal froze when the alert came through. A drill gone wrong was one thing. A deliberate execution was another. His first order: pause the simulation, isolate the humans, and retrieve all soldiers for debrief. The order was never received. Every comm line to the strike teams had gone. Dead within 60 seconds. What few drone feeds remained showed only flickers, shadows moving in patterns too fast and too precise to be random. Silence followed, then static. Inside the compound, things were unraveling faster than anyone had predicted. The humans were no longer scattered and passive. They were hunting. Every movement had purpose. Every engagement ended with dead soldiers and missing gear. In one section, a sergeant's body was found bound and used as bait, his locator beacon hacked to lure reinforcements into a trap. None made it out. By the 20th minute, more than a third of the deployed troops were unaccounted for. Vectal refused to accept it. Escalate to Tier 2 response. Use live ammo. But no order could change the fact that the humans were already ahead. They had seized a central node in the station's infrastructure, rerouted internal access points, and begun using the aliens' own surveillance against them. One tech officer whispered in disbelief, "They're watching us." More footage streamed in. A human appeared on screen, darting through a maintenance tunnel. Thin, fast, absolutely silent. Another clip showed a squad entering a corridor only. to trigger a makeshift explosive hidden behind a ventilation grate. When recovery teams finally accessed the blast zone, there were no survivors. Pieces of equipment had been stripped. One helmet had its camera removed, wiring coiled with precision. Not scavengers, engineers. Callan Reich was leading them, always one step ahead. In the few seconds his face appeared on security footage, his expression was unreadable. No joy, no rage, just focus. Tactical brilliance guided his every action. Each kill, each detour, each repurposed piece of alien tech, it all served a greater strategy. He wasn't just reacting, he was executing a plan that had begun long before the simulation ever launched. The bodies piled up. Vectal's staff started turning on each other. Some accused the tech division of sabotage, others blamed the station design. None could admit the truth. They had underestimated the humans entirely. For centuries, the story had been repeated. Humans were broken, scattered, extinct. Their extinction was celebrated, studied, even ritualized in military academies. But they were never gone. They were dormant. And now that they had surfaced again, they moved with terrifying clarity. Back in the command center, one officer pulled up schematics of the station's original construction. "This sector was human-made during the early wars," she said. "They know it better than we do." Another officer ran a systems diagnostic. "They've overridden oxygen controls in 4 compartments, sealed the doors. We've got troops trapped with no air." Panic erupted as another station-wide alert blared. Fire suppression offline. Gravlocks disengaged. Security turrets reprogrammed. The humans weren't guests in the simulation anymore. They were owners. From one of the compromised comm lines, a distorted voice came through. It was human, calm, controlled. "You brought us here to be prey. You wanted to test yourselves. Now you'll learn what real fear feels like." The line cut. 2 alien lieutenants attempted to evacuate their remaining squads to the docking bay, only to find the hangar sealed tight. A reroute attempt triggered an explosion. The emergency exit protocols had been rewritten by someone with intimate knowledge of the station's deepest architecture. The kind of knowledge only someone who had lived through Earth's fall could possess. Vectal's confidence shattered. He barked orders with diminishing authority. His voice cracked. No one followed. Officers stared blankly at failing screens. Red warnings and systems that no longer responded to their touch. It wasn't just that they were losing control. Control had never belonged to them. A single data file leaked onto the open network. A fragment of footage. Ancient and raw. It showed Earth's final moments. Flaming skies, orbital bombardments, children screaming in bunkers. It wasn't propaganda. It was a reminder. Vectal recognized the clip. He had seen it during his early years in the service. It was classified and buried decades ago. How did they have it? The implications were chilling. The humans hadn't come here to fight. They had come to speak, through action, through precision, through horror. And the message was clear. We remember. The killing accelerated. One wing of the station went dark entirely. Surveillance bots sent to investigate never returned. In desperation, the command team attempted to initiate total lockdown, a final defense measure designed to seal all exits, cut power, and flush oxygen from every sector not manually authenticated, a last resort. But the system returned a cold rejection, access denied, override detected. By then, over 70% of the alien personnel were confirmed dead or missing. Those still alive had barricaded themselves into small rooms, whispering to one another, eyes darting at every creak of metal. Some began turning on their weapons. Others disabled their own. Trackers, hoping to disappear. The simulation was never real. The deaths were. And the fear? That was just beginning. The original assumption was that the humans had somehow stumbled upon an opportunity, reacting instinctively with the fury of cornered animals. But that illusion collapsed when Command reviewed the patterns. Every ambush, every sabotage, every calculated detour through the station's infrastructure followed a path too coordinated to be chance. The humans weren't improvising. They were operating on a framework, a battle doctrine, adapted, focused, and refined. Deep files retrieved from forgotten archives revealed that the humans captured for this simulation were not civilians. They were descendants of the Earth remnants, isolated war clans formed during the final hours of the human conflict, left to rot on barren moons, chemical wastelands, and gravity-shattered colonies. These descendants had evolved without mercy. Genetic drift and forced survival pressures had shaped them into perfect predators. Starvation had taught them patience, ruins had taught them silence, and loss had taught them rage. Callan Reich had been trained since birth in a world with no comfort, no forgiveness, no rescue. Earth's fall was not history to him. It was legacy. His bloodline traced back to a biomechanical division, blacklisted even by pre-quarantine human governments. A breed of tactical monsters, bred not for politics or negotiation, but for extinction-level countermeasures. That same blood flowed cold in his veins now. What Vectal and the observers didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that this wasn't the first time Callan had fought aliens. It was just the first time they were watching. He'd spent years decoding the Alliance's languages, infrastructure, operational habits. When the drill was proposed and the prisoners selected, Callan had ensured his group was included. His silence during processing had nothing to do with fear. It was discipline. He had counted weapons, measured guard rotations, timed security, resets down to the second. This was not rebellion. It was execution. Even the tools they used were not improvisations. Rebar, broken plating, scavenged electronics. Each weapon handcrafted with anatomical precision. One alien had his neurocore targeted through a weak joint in his armor's left clavicle, a blind spot that required surgical knowledge. Another had his leg arteries severed while standing perfectly still, unaware that the oxygen in the room had already been siphoned just enough to dull reflexes. The humans were using the environment, exploiting everything, manipulating temperature fluctuations to avoid heat detection, filling air ducts with magnetic debris to jam motion sensors. One unit used an alien corpse to bypass an ID scanner, its eye manually connected to a cracked retinal override system. These weren't acts of desperation. They were acts of mastery. Panic spread further when the first medic's report came in. "They're not killing randomly," she said. "They're prioritizing targets. Officers first, medics second, comms specialists third. The pattern is surgical." The station was not a battleground. It was a vivisection. Back at command, the more experienced analysts began whispering terms the younger officers didn't understand. Deep war doctrines, Earth-born insurgency tactics, planetary denial principles. These weren't extinct footnotes. They were playing out in real time. A dozen systems had classified these behaviors as cultural myths. Now, watching the kill counts rise and the bodies vanish, no one could deny it anymore. The humans had planned to be captured. They had planned for the drill. They had planned for every hallway, every hatch, every reaction. Because this wasn't the war. It was the test. One human survivor, caught briefly on internal feed, was seen painting something, in blood on the wall, symbols none of the aliens recognized. Linguists scrambled to decipher it. Minutes later, the symbols were matched to Earth-standard glyphs. Translation: observe and regret. Internal containment squads, sent to recapture Sector 7, never reported back. What remained of them was later recovered, folded, stacked, and arranged in what appeared to be a form of ancient ritual display, not decorative, symbolic. The last soldier's helmet contained a single phrase, etched into the interior lining. "We are not your prey." Despite the brutality, one fact became terrifyingly clear. The humans weren't killing everyone, Engineers, medics, junior officers, many were left alive, shaken, witnesses. Callan's team had no interest in total annihilation. They had a message, and they were choosing who would carry it forward. In one intercepted exchange between humans, translated through lip-reading software, Callan said to his second-in-command, "We don't need numbers, just fear. The rest spreads on its own." The aliens had no countermeasure. Their training prepared them for invasion, for fleet warfare, for brute force. But not this. Not for enemies who moved like ghosts, struck like precision weapons, and vanished before a scream could rise. Whole sections of the station became graveyards, lights flickering in rhythm with the dripping of blood. And still, the humans did not stop. They used alien fear against them, triggered pre-recorded human cries to lure response teams, flooded air ducts with pheromonal markers designed to mimic alien distress calls. One officer was found screaming uncontrollably in a supply closet, having turned his own weapon on 3 of his comrades in a hallucination-induced panic. The medics couldn't determine what chemical compound had triggered it, but it wasn't alien. The horror became systemic. Alien soldiers started abandoning posts, throwing down weapons. Some attempted suicide rather than be captured. Their minds could not reconcile what they were experiencing. The prey had not only turned, they had always been predators. Vectal no longer gave orders. He sat silently, watching the list of casualties grow by the second, watching the human signals move freely through sectors that were supposed to be inaccessible. Every new act of resistance felt futile, every idea already predicted. The last report before blackout read simply, "They've taken the core hub." And then came the final transmission, from Callan Reich, calm, measured, icy. "You thought this was a game, a scenario, a drill. It was never that. It was the first consequence." And then darkness. No more feeds, no more orders, just silence. And what followed it? Across the upper tiers of command, disbelief was quickly being replaced with panic. What had been pitched as a public spectacle of dominance was unraveling into a documented failure. The galaxy had been watching from the start, expecting a show of strength, a reinforcement of the long-standing narrative that humanity had been permanently broken. Instead, what streamed across thousands of feeds was a slow realization. The extinct species was not only alive, but it was dangerous in a way no one was prepared to admit. Inside the High Council chamber of the Central Broadcast Center, diplomats, military strategists, and intelligence officials argued over the footage in real time. "It's impossible," one ambassador said, eyes locked on the screen where a human strangled an armed alien using nothing but a twisted metal cable. They were supposed to be manageable. But no explanation could erase what they were seeing. The Alliance soldiers were dying faster than they could react. Whole sectors were lost. Commanders were outmaneuvered by prisoners with no weapons and no supplies. The word simulation no longer held meaning. Commander Vectal tried one. Final time to de-escalate. He activated the comms array and broadcast to all human frequencies, offering terms. "Surrender now, and you'll be granted rights under interstellar law. We will offer food, treatment, and safe return." The message echoed through the compound's walls. There was no response, only the quiet hum of systems being overtaken. Minutes later, the station's mainframe projected an archived Earth broadcast, dated over 200 years prior. It showed alien ships raining plasma over major cities. Entire continents burned alive. Then came the footage of the aftermath. Blackened landscapes, skeletal remains, children holding on to corpses. No commentary, no words, just memory. The stream cut to static. Then Callan's voice broke through. "You turned genocide into history. We turned history into doctrine. It wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration. And for the first time, Those watching understood that this was not retaliation fueled by emotion. It was premeditated, precise, and deliberate. The humans had bided their time, hidden their capabilities, and waited for the right moment to resurface. They had infiltrated a scenario engineered to humiliate them, and instead converted it into an unfiltered demonstration of tactical superiority. Vectal's face drained of color. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't rebellion. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare being broadcast to every species that had once cheered Earth's destruction. Panic swept the outer colonies first. Civilian terminals buzzed, with unfiltered footage of soldiers begging for extraction, bleeding out in silence, hunted by enemies that were never supposed to return. Within the simulation station, the humans no longer needed to hide. They moved with purpose, bypassing resistance entirely. Any alien forces still attempting to fight were evaded, misdirected, or simply ignored. The humans weren't just dismantling the military presence, they were claiming territory. Each control hub they seized was locked down, interfaces rewritten, cameras turned outward. A specialist aboard the Galactic Observation Ship monitoring the exercise noticed something chilling. The humans weren't disabling surveillance. They were enhancing it. The footage being broadcast wasn't accidental. It was curated, edited, each angle, each kill, each spoken word, designed to deliver maximum psychological impact. The humans were using the simulation's own media protocols to transmit their message across every known system, not just to leaders, but to civilians, children, traders, farmers, soldiers. Every corner of the galaxy was being reminded that humanity had never been tamed, only silenced, and that silence had been misinterpreted. The war doctrine of Earth's last survivors didn't rely on overwhelming force. It was rooted in surgical domination, instilling fear by allowing survivors, letting them tell the story, letting the legend grow. Every alien left alive inside that station would carry more damage than any broadcast could deliver. One feed cut to a corridor where a group of young officers attempted to flee through a back channel. Instead of pursuit, the humans released them. No weapons drawn, no attacks made. The officers stumbled out into the open, crying, terrified, unscathed. One turned and whispered to his squad mate, "They let us go." That footage was replayed millions of times across the network. It wasn't seen as mercy, it was seen as confidence. By hour 2 of the operation, alien social media platforms crashed under the weight of traffic. People weren't turning away, in horror. They were watching in awe. The stories their textbooks had written off as exaggerations now played out in real time. The myths of Earth's soldiers, tireless, strategic, relentless, were more than true. They had been understated. Across government channels, leaders debated emergency containment protocols. Suggestions ranged from deploying orbital bombardments to invoking interstellar war powers, but nothing could be acted on fast enough. The humans had already locked down the station's outer defenses, and their control over internal systems meant any aggressive response risked killing their own forces and broadcasting more chaos. They were trapped, militarily, politically, and psychologically. Then came another leak, an internal document, decades old, marked Eyes Only. It contained analysis from a now-defunct intelligence bureau that had once warned of exactly this. A final line from the document spread like wildfire across comms channels. Should any survivors of the Human Extermination Initiative remain, and should they reappear, assume they will not seek war. Assume they will end it. That line was read aloud by a council member during an emergency meeting. The chamber fell silent. What had been a public training op had become the moment the galaxy was forced to confront its mistake. They had turned Earth into an example. And in doing so, they had created something worse than an enemy. They had created a warning. Now the warning had returned, and it had chosen the perfect place to speak. on their terms, using their tools in front of their people. Not a single shot had been fired by an official military force. Not a single battle had been declared. And yet the fear spreading across the galaxy was greater than any war that had ever come before. The lights in the lower decks flickered once, then died completely. Emergency backups kicked in, but only in half the sectors. The rest went dark. Dead air, dead cameras, dead movement. The last operatives sent to sweep those areas didn't return. Tracking signals showed them stopped mid-route, clustered too closely. No signs of firefights. Just silence. The humans weren't fighting battles anymore. They were creating kill zones. They had stopped reacting and started controlling. Every corridor was now a trap, every hatch a calculated risk. The layout of the station had been reversed in purpose. It was no longer a military simulation ground. It was a hunting ground. Callan's team used debris as weapons. They used the angles of the corridors to amplify their movements, to stay hidden from corner cams, to funnel squads where they wanted them. One airlock was sabotaged to vent when accessed from the inside. 3 alien troops were pulled into space. Before they realized, the door had been rewired. Inside the station, the gravity fluctuated without pattern. In one corridor, soldiers found themselves floating without warning, only to be ambushed by a human who'd timed the attack to coincide with the artificial gravity drop. There were no explosive charges, no flashy theatrics. The violence was stripped of glamour. It was brutal, efficient, and cold. A squad of 6 moved through what they believed was a clear zone. Only 5 emerged. No gunfire, no struggle. 1 was just gone. The remaining 5 began to turn on each, others suspecting treachery, unable to trust what they saw. The humans had mastered the most dangerous weapon, uncertainty. In the core reactor shaft, remnants of 2 alien squads were found with their helmets removed, suffocated. Oxygen levels in the shaft had been slowly siphoned over the course of an hour. The systems hadn't triggered an alarm. The environmental readings had been overwritten. The thresholds altered just below alert status. That level of subtlety required not just knowledge, but experience. It required someone who had spent years studying this exact kind of station, predicting its behaviors, measuring its weaknesses. Callan hadn't just trained for this. He had planned for it. The humans understood. Fear, not as a tool of cruelty, but as a force multiplier. They didn't chase. They didn't shout. They left symbols, markings in blood, smears on walls. A line of alien dog tags hung from the ceiling like wind chimes. One room was found with every wall mirrored and coated in thin reflective panels, positioned perfectly to reflect a single human face across every surface. The soldier who entered dropped his rifle, knelt, and wept. The surviving aliens were now isolated into pockets. They'd begun locking doors behind themselves, turning corridors into cages. But the humans didn't need those spaces. They had already mapped every maintenance tunnel, every pressure vent, every emergency bypass that Alliance engineers had forgotten to mention in their briefings. They traveled beneath their enemies, above them, beside them. In places, the aliens didn't know existed. One soldier fired at a shadow and hit another soldier. Friendly fire rates spiked as panic set in. Comms flooded with conflicting reports. They're in the ceiling. They can mimic voices. They're not dying. Rumors spread faster than commands. The humans never denied these claims. They let them grow. Let the fear compound itself. The medics reported something disturbing. Of the humans encountered and wounded, none cried out, none begged. One bled out while stabbing his own leg to distract a sentry. Another tore a wound, opened further to loosen his restraints. Pain was not a barrier. It was a tool. The aliens began referring to them as specters, no longer seeing them as soldiers or prisoners, just inevitable ends waiting in the dark. Every attempt to reorganize failed. Officers called for regrouping at rally points only to find those points already compromised. Supplies went missing. Ammunition stockpiles disappeared. A weapons locker was found emptied, then returned hours later, every round replaced with blanks. One by one, the aliens began abandoning their posts. Not fleeing, just giving up. They left rifles where they stood, turned off their radios, locked themselves inside closets, and hoped the walls would keep them safe. One commander ordered a full sweep using thermal drones. The drones launched. They tracked movement. But when the footage came back, all the targets disappeared mid-frame. They weren't cloaked. They weren't hidden. They simply stopped being there. The humans had learned how to manipulate the station's heat signature readouts. Or worse, they never registered in the first place. In the next broadcast, hijacked, again by Callan, the footage played not of kills, but of stillness. A hallway with nothing. Then flickers. Then bodies. Then nothing again. The message was simple. You're not fighting ghosts. You're just too slow to see us. The signal ended. A list of names appeared. Names of every squad leader killed so far. Underlined. Indexed by time. Accuracy down to the second. The alien government stations that had originally approved the simulation issued silence protocols. They stopped transmitting, fearing that any response might make them targets. Entire media channels went dark, not because of censorship, but because no one knew what to say. The blood had stopped being shocking. It had become inevitable. In the final hour of the kill zone phase, one alien attempted to self-destruct the environmental core. The override failed. The humans had already blocked the command chain and rerouted manual access through 7 false junctions. When he finally found the real one, Callan was already there, waiting, wordless. The kill zones weren't random. They were deliberate, structured, and scaled. The humans had used them not just to eliminate resistance, but to study reactions. They tested fear responses, observed delays in comm relays, analyzed coordination decay under stress. The entire massacre had been an experiment, and by its end, the results were clear. The simulation was over. The control was theirs. The Alliance High Command received the initial reports with skepticism. They assumed exaggeration, maybe even sabotage. The idea that a handful of humans had turned a full-scale military simulation into a massacre seemed absurd. But as the casualty lists grew and contact with their best units vanished, that confidence began to rot. The station's AI had stopped responding to overrides. Emergency recall codes were rejected. Surveillance feeds returned only static or haunting still frames of blood-slick corridors and discarded armor. A hush fell over the war room, not one of calm, but of realization. Something had gone fundamentally wrong. Dozens of specialists were summoned, engineers, cybersecurity officers, even psychologists. They all came to the same conclusion. The humans had not only taken over the battlefield, they had taken over the data. They controlled what was seen, what was believed, and what was denied. It wasn't just technological superiority, it was willful manipulation, cold, calculated dominance over perception itself. And that was more dangerous than any weapon. What the Alliance once called a drill had become an evolving machine of psychological warfare, engineered in real time by people once considered primitives. One admiral suggested orbital bombardment. A silence followed. Then another voice cut in. What if there were survivors from their own side still on the station? A counterpoint came immediately. What if the humans had already escaped and they were just baiting retaliation? No one could answer with certainty. And that uncertainty made them hesitate. For the first time, the Alliance faced a threat that didn't just kill. It made them question every decision they made. Meanwhile, across the fractured sectors of the station, the remaining alien units received their final orders. Hold your position and wait. Reinforcements would arrive within 72 hours. But deep down, none believed they'd survive that long. The humans weren't wiping them out with brute force anymore. They were collapsing their morale. Communication between squads became erratic. Some units started ignoring commands, others begged for extraction, but the transports never came. Orbiting vessels had lost all docking permissions. Navigation relays were disabled. Every shuttle sent down vanished. Some were intercepted. Others simply stopped transmitting seconds before touchdown. In one chilling instance, a transmission was received from a dropship moments before landing. Visual contact. Wait, something's wrong. Then silence. The black box footage was recovered hours later not by the Alliance but by the humans, who edited it with mocking subtitles and broadcast it back on every emergency frequency. The message was clear. You are not rescuers, you are prey. Back on the bridge of the main Alliance command ship, leaders debated escalating to full-scale military action, deploy a battle fleet, secure the station by force, and if necessary, destroy it completely. But as they prepared, their own systems began acting irregularly. Minor malfunctions, delayed responses, lights flickering, life support shifting parameters. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence, then as sabotage. But one technician spoke the truth. They're already here. A file appeared on every secure screen, no delivery path, no sender ID, just one video. Inside, Callan stood before a ruined corridor, blood-stained and calm. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Behind him hung a banner, an Alliance war flag, defaced with handprints and tally marks. Beneath it, the message, "This was never your station." The command structure began to collapse. Orders became fragmented. Distrust spread. Some captains refused to lower their ships near the station. Others abandoned their fleets altogether. Dozens of mid-level commanders resigned or locked themselves in their quarters. One vessel even turned its guns inward, destroying its own communications arrays. The psychological damage wasn't limited to those on the station. It was bleeding into space. Then the final shift occurred. The humans stopped hiding. Every surviving alien unit still on board began receiving identical pings. Not from stealth signatures, not from hacked frequencies, but from open channels. Human soldiers were broadcasting their locations, not to taunt, not to bait, but to announce. As if daring the aliens to come finish what they started. Some squads tried. They regrouped and launched coordinated attacks toward these signals. None returned, not even screams, just silence. Then, hours later, those same signals reappeared from different sectors. The humans were moving freely now, unchallenged, unafraid. Not ghosts, predators. The station belonged to them. And worse, some of the messages they sent weren't even from Callan's team anymore. New names, new signatures, recruits who had joined along the way, survivors, prisoners, even rogue AI, subsystems reprogrammed by human hands. The uprising had evolved into something larger. The Alliance couldn't understand it. They had expected aggression, violence. They hadn't prepared for adaptation. They had believed humans needed numbers, or better technology. But humans didn't need advantages. They needed time. Time to learn. Time to exploit. Time to transform even a disadvantage into a trap. This wasn't survival. It was evolution under fire. And it was spreading. Whispers leaked across military. Intelligence channels, other stations experiencing similar glitches. Small crews reporting missing supplies. Rogue signals in long-range scanners. One fleet reported the complete loss of an automated carrier just minutes after arriving near an abandoned station. No survivors. Only a log entry left behind. Initiation. Successful. Protocol Callan verified. At that point, the High Command declared a Level 0 containment protocol, a classification reserved for existential threats. Only twice before had such a protocol been invoked. Both times it involved species-level extinction scenarios. That same level was now applied to a handful of humans. The absurdity of it didn't matter anymore. It was the only classification. that matched reality. Still, they couldn't attack, not effectively. Every warship within firing range had systems compromised in ways they didn't understand. One dreadnought found its own security drones turning on the crew mid-flight. Another lost its targeting systems and began spinning uncontrollably in orbit. Engineers traced the errors but couldn't find a cause. It was as if the station below had infected everything around it, and above all, they still didn't know how the humans had done it. The station hadn't been overtaken with superior weapons. There were no nuclear events, no biological agents, no hacking from external forces. It had been done entirely within the confines of their own rules. With scrap, with planning, with sheer will. The only conclusion left was one no one wanted to speak aloud. The humans hadn't broken the simulation. They had used it exactly as intended, and still won. The Council's emergency meeting convened in absolute silence, an unspoken tension tightening the room like a noose. The feeds from the simulation station had gone entirely dark. No contact, no explanation, and no confirmation of the survival of any deployed unit. The reality they all feared was now unavoidable. The humans hadn't just turned the drill into a real war. They had won it, completely. Worse still, they had done so while the Alliance was watching. Every action, every tactic, every shift had been observed by military strategists, analysts, and high command officers, and none of them had foreseen the ending. Arguments broke out. One faction demanded immediate retaliation. Another insisted it was a trap. A few dared to suggest that retaliation was no longer a viable option, that perhaps what had occurred wasn't a fluke, it was a message, not just from the soldiers involved, but from humanity itself. That thought alone was enough to fracture the Council's already brittle unity. Old assumptions crumbled. The age-old belief that humans were unfit for integrated command, that their emotions made them too volatile, too irrational, was now an open question. Perhaps that irrationality had been misjudged. Perhaps it wasn't a weakness. Perhaps it was their deadliest asset. Across dozens of systems, word of the massacre spread. Even censored networks couldn't stop the data leaks. Soldiers began whispering about the Callan Protocol. Civilians saw bootleg footage of aliens fleeing in terror, while a human in torn gear walked through fire with calm precision. Some called it fiction. Others knew better. On mining colonies and fringe outposts, humans were no longer the underestimated species. They were becoming something else, something feared. Recruiters saw an uptick in enlistments. Combat programs had to rewrite their training models. The paradigm was shifting, and every civilization in the Council felt it in their bones. Meanwhile, on the fractured remains of the drill station, Callan and the others were no longer hiding. With the enemy gone or too afraid to return, they moved openly through the halls they now claimed as their own. They had converted the entire infrastructure into a living memory of what had occurred. Trophies were not taken out of pride, but purpose. Disassembled weapons, etched armor, and recordings of terrified alien commanders were archived into a makeshift museum, not for themselves, but for whoever came next. They wanted it known. They wanted it remembered. This was no anomaly. This was human warfare fully awakened, and still there was no gloating, no speeches, no declarations of victory. The humans didn't broadcast threats or demand concessions. They just waited. And in that waiting, the silence became more terrifying than any open assault. It was silence with intent. The kind that precedes storms, not peace. And across the Council, fear took root. Not just fear of human soldiers, but of human ideas. The idea that one species, backed into a corner with no support, could dismantle everything the galaxy had believed about warfare, hierarchy, and control. In the academies, doctrines were rewritten. Engagement with human units must never rely on simulation assumptions. Containment protocols must begin at first contact. Failure to preemptively disarm small human teams is equivalent to strategic surrender. These were not suggestions, they were mandates. Entire fleets were reassigned just to monitor Earth-related operations. Probes were launched, treaties revisited. Some member species questioned whether humanity should be expelled entirely from the Council. But even that debate revealed the deeper truth. No one wanted to provoke them further. Not after this. Not when the cost had already been blood, credibility, and control. The few survivors from the alien forces were brought in for debriefing. What they described didn't sound like a battle. It sounded like a reckoning. Coordinated ambushes from dead zones. Rewired drones acting like pack hunters. Human units moving without visible communication, anticipating every counter and setting traps days in advance. The most chilling testimony came from a commander who had escaped only because his team abandoned him. We thought we were testing them, but they were testing us, and we failed. Back on Earth, the incident caused ripples across every military division. Callan's name was no longer just associated with insubordination. It had become synonymous with dominance. But he didn't return for medals. He didn't speak to the media. In fact, no one saw him again for weeks. He and his surviving team had disappeared, vanished into the shadows of Black Ops Command, absorbed into a program so classified even the Council couldn't confirm it existed. It didn't matter. Their legend had already taken root. And legends, especially in war, are more dangerous than armies. Attempts were made to sanitize the event. The Alliance issued vague reports, downplaying casualties and reframing the incident as a training disruption. But truth has gravity. It pulled the facts back into orbit. Independent records, private testimonies, and leaked data from military, AI cores all painted the same story. Humans had turned a controlled drill into a real war and walked away not just victorious, but transformed. This wasn't survival, it was revelation. And now, everything changed. Human forces were reassessed not as auxiliary, but as strategic leaders. Joint command requests began to flow in from factions that once refused even basic integration. For the first time in decades, high command officers from non-human species applied to train under human protocols. Battle sims were updated with Callan scenarios. Intelligence agencies were tasked with reviewing every past drill that had included human participation, just in case more signs had been missed. But it was already too late. The change had come and gone, and no amount of damage control could undo the truth. The Council passed emergency protocols requiring all future war simulations involving humans to be monitored by live command officers with override authority. A laughable gesture, considering override authority meant nothing when the humans no longer played by alien rules. That was the lesson no one could forget. They hadn't hacked the system. They'd played within it, better than anyone else. 1. High-ranking strategist was recorded off the record saying, "If this had been a real war, we would have lost 3 fleets before we even knew we were fighting." He wasn't exaggerating. And that thought lingered in every war room, every policy draft, every nervous commander now forced to factor humanity into their calculations. Not as allies, not as wild cards, but as apex predators in disguise. Earth didn't respond to the Alliance's formal inquiries. No diplomatic channels were opened, no ambassadors sent, just silence. That silence, again, louder than any declaration. And within that silence grew the one truth the galaxy could no longer deny. The drill was over. But the real war had just begun. The analysis began with desperation. The Council assembled its best tacticians, data scientists, war historians, and psychological experts to dissect every millisecond of the simulation-turned massacre. Hundreds of hours of decrypted combat logs, environmental scans, intercepted human comms, and battlefield telemetry were fed into AI systems designed to detect patterns. What emerged wasn't a glitch in strategy or a lucky outcome. It was a systematic dismantling of an entire military doctrine. The humans hadn't reacted to pressure. They had anticipated it. Everything they did, from their initial retreat into the lower levels to their brutal ambushes, had been premeditated. The simulation was supposed to test stress response. Instead, it had revealed strategic supremacy. The key difference wasn't numbers or equipment, it was mindset. Human soldiers treated every battle as real, regardless of the label. There were no drills in their psychology. Every moment was life or death. Every mistake was potentially fatal. This bred a different kind of warrior, one who didn't waste time adjusting to threat levels or waiting for orders. Human squads operated like organisms, adaptive and instinctive. Not one analyst could explain how such small groups had created full-spectrum dominance without external support. No logistics, no reinforcements, no AI-controlled artillery. Just grit, aggression, and an eerie patience that seemed utterly alien to the Council's doctrines. Worse still, the deeper the data analysts looked, the more anomalies they found. In one encounter, a 3-human team had disabled an entire armored column using nothing but repurposed mining drones and heat triggers. Another segment revealed a lone operator creating chaos through misdirection alone, planting fake signals, triggering false evacuations, and convincing enemy squads to fire on each other. It wasn't just efficiency, it was performance art made of violence. The conclusion was undeniable. Humans weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to teach, and the lesson was clear. If you come for us, you better bring everything. And even then, it might not be enough. The political consequences were immediate. Earth's representative seat, long seen as symbolic, suddenly became the center of attention. Once dismissed at council meetings, human envoys were now feared. Treaties once forced upon humanity under duress were quietly retracted or amended. Trade sanctions vanished overnight. Offers for mutual defense pacts began arriving from species that previously wouldn't have shared airspace with Earth. It wasn't respect, it was fear management. Galactic empires didn't know what humanity wanted, but they were terrified to find out the hard way. Military doctrine across the Council fractured. Several species openly defied Central Command, pulling their officers from human-led joint exercises in panic. Others doubled down, hoping proximity would buy them favor or at least reduce their likelihood of annihilation. The most paranoid commanders began treating their own humans like embedded spies, scrutinizing every move, every glance, every unscheduled break in routine. But what unnerved them most was how calm the humans remained. No boasting, no propaganda, no threat broadcasts, just silence, laced with the knowledge that they had won a war without declaring it. Civilian populations weren't spared either. The leaked footage sparked mass hysteria on some worlds. Conspiracy forums declared Earth home to ancient war gods. Some cults even sprang up worshipping human soldiers as divine avatars of destruction. One popular chant spread in dozens of languages. They trained for fiction and made it real. On frontier worlds, rumors circulated that Earth had deployed more such units quietly across the galaxy, observing, waiting, ready to respond if threatened. These whispers were never confirmed, but they didn't need to be. In fear, perception becomes reality. Back on Earth, things were changing too. The returning soldiers weren't treated as heroes. They were debriefed, isolated, and absorbed into higher-tier black operations. New training centers opened, not in secret, but in plain sight. Recruitment swelled. Cadet programs were redesigned around what happened during the drill. Psychological conditioning was intensified. Simulations became more brutal. Earth didn't gloat about its victory. It prepared for the next phase. Because deep inside, they knew the Council wouldn't accept what happened. Not truly. The balance had shifted, and empires rarely surrendered pride without a second attempt. Some species began clandestine arms races. New anti-human tech projects emerged, mostly theoretical. Neural scramblers, AI sabotage platforms, anti-stealth, satellites. None of them worked in simulations. The problem wasn't human hardware, it was the humans themselves. They didn't rely on one method. They adapted, mutated, evolved. Each human warfighter had hundreds of micro-strategies and backups embedded in muscle memory and instinct. No algorithm could predict their decisions. No traditional force could match their fluidity. Every war game ran with updated parameters. Still ended in defeat. One AI test ran 10,000 simulations. Humans won 9,992. The other 8 ended in stalemates. Desperation turned into paranoia. Whispers began spreading inside command halls about whether humanity had always been like this, or if something had changed. Some suggested the drill wasn't an accident, but a trial run for something bigger. Others feared humans had begun experimenting with neural enhancements, possibly even psychic links. Of course, there was no evidence, but the fear itself changed. Behavior. Border patrols tripled near human sectors. Every unidentified signal was treated as a potential threat. Peace talks were postponed indefinitely. The council couldn't admit they were afraid, but every reaction proved they were. Meanwhile, within the deepest layers of Earth's command networks, a new doctrine was being quietly written. Not one meant for the public or even allied governments. It was for internal use only. The title was short: Massacre Response Doctrine, Post-Simulation Deployment. It outlined rapid deployment contingencies, deep infiltration protocols, and silent war escalation triggers. The humans weren't preparing for peace. They were preparing for the inevitable, retaliation. They had shattered the illusion of weakness, and now they expected the galaxy to respond the way all threatened powers do, violently and without warning. But the greatest shift wasn't military, it was cultural. Across Earth, the public now knew the truth. Their species had faced the worst the galaxy could simulate and turned it into a warning. Documentaries, classified leaks, and soldier memoirs lit up the networks. Recruitment soared not because of glory, but because of clarity. Humanity now knew what it was to be underestimated, mocked, discarded, and what it meant to prove them all wrong. They didn't seek domination. They wanted recognition, but they understood something the Council never did. Sometimes peace isn't given, it's enforced, and so the galaxy tilted. The center of fear was no longer in black hole systems or ancient war relics. It was in a blue and green planet at the edge of a spiral arm, a planet that, when provoked, didn't scream or flail. It planned. It waited, and then it destroyed you in silence, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. And now that everyone knew, no one could forget. The humans had arrived, and they weren't asking for a seat at the table anymore. They were deciding who got to sit there. The Council's gamble to contain the fallout had already failed. Attempts to censor the footage of the simulation incident were overwhelmed by thousands of anonymous uploads, mirror servers, even black market copies sold on data sticks. The more they tried to bury it, the more it spread. Not just to military officials or politicians, but to civilians, insurgents, pirates, rebels, and black ops groups scattered across the galactic fringe. Everyone now had a front row seat to humanity's capabilities, and no one was laughing anymore. The massacre had become a legend, but it was a legend backed by brutal high-resolution reality. It changed the rules of fear itself. Some factions saw opportunity in the chaos. Mercenary guilds once dominated by Vokar or Drenari elites now rushed to hire human advisors. Corporations contracted ex-military humans to redesign their entire security infrastructures. Even criminal cartels began recruiting Earth-born tacticians, offering fortunes just to learn how they thought. Not because of loyalty or shared values, but because humans had proven that they could outmaneuver, outfight, and outlast any traditional force. They were no longer the species to mock, they were the species to copy if survival was the goal. And so a new arms race began. Not for weapons or ships, but for humans themselves. Offers flooded in, Training contracts, joint programs, secret deals to relocate human combat units off-world. Earth refused all of them, not out of arrogance, but clarity. They knew the game now. Their value had shifted from curiosity to threat. If they allowed themselves to be dissected and distributed, they'd become diluted, vulnerable. The real power wasn't just in human soldiers, it was in how Earth controlled them, directed them, shielded them from exploitation. The galaxy was panicking, and Earth was quietly building something even deadlier. Within hidden orbital foundries and subterranean complexes, humanity initiated Protocol Hydra. The project wasn't about building a bigger bomb or a better fighter. It was about decentralized power, duplicating the mindset that had shocked the galaxy and embedding it into autonomous units. Swarms of AI-linked drones, each one carrying fragments of human combat doctrine, capable of learning and adapting in real time. Synthetic warriors designed not to mimic humans but to amplify them. Ghost units, barely detectable, fully independent, pre-programmed with escalation tiers that would respond without needing centralized orders. Earth wasn't just preparing for retaliation, it was ensuring that even if humanity fell, their vengeance would be automatic. And this terrified the Council more than the massacre itself, because it meant Earth didn't need to be present to be lethal. They could plant their will like seeds across star systems, each one a potential extinction level, event waiting to bloom. It was the ultimate deterrent, and no one knew how many units already existed or where they had been placed. Council Command scrambled to form a unified response, but internal fractures tore through their structure. Some factions wanted to negotiate, some to preemptively strike, others to go completely dark and hide. No consensus was reached, and the paralysis only strengthened Earth's position. Meanwhile, Earth's intelligence networks were 2 steps ahead. They intercepted plans, sabotaged early strikes, leaked false data to manipulate panic. On the surface, humanity maintained its diplomatic calm. But underground, everything was sharpening. War games intensified. Children grew up studying the massacre like it was ancient myth, learning every maneuver, every trick, every cold execution. Schools didn't glorify violence, but they didn't flinch from it either. Peace through dominance became more than a motto, it became doctrine. Not because humanity wanted conquest, but because they now knew the cost of being underestimated. And still, they said nothing. No declarations, no ultimatums, just silence and the growing weight of consequence. Other species began to self-police out of fear of provoking Earth. In distant sectors, pirate clans surrendered to human patrols before shots were fired. In contested zones, ceasefires emerged not from treaties, but from mutual agreement to avoid drawing Earth's gaze. Humanity had changed the very shape of war without firing another shot. They had mastered the rarest power in the galaxy, deterrence by reputation alone. But not everyone learned. In the outer reaches, a rogue alliance known as the Threx Initiative formed. Composed of exiled military leaders, defunct warlords, and anti-human ideologues, they believed the only path to safety was immediate, overwhelming force. They began amassing a fleet in secret, building weapons designed specifically to counter human physiology and tactics. Experimental bioweapons, mind disruption fields, and AI viruses crafted to corrupt human logic systems. Their goal wasn't just to beat Earth. It was to erase its threat entirely. They called it Operation Clean Sweep. And they were wrong, because Earth knew. They always knew. By the time Threx launched their test incursion on the Helios Drift, humanity had already installed a forward operating base beneath its largest moon. The rogue fleet never made it to orbit. No broadcast, no warning, just signal blackout, then wreckage. The Council tried to investigate but found nothing. Not a single transmission, not a survivor, not a hint of who or what had retaliated. Only One encrypted message was discovered buried in a destroyed Threx warcruiser's core systems. 3 words: "You were warned." After that, resistance crumbled, not from conquest but exhaustion. The galaxy realized that Earth didn't just win battles, they prevented wars from even starting, not through diplomacy, through certainty. The certainty that if they were pushed again, what happened during the drill would seem merciful in comparison. So the threats quieted, the shadows retreated, and for the first time in generations, the galaxy found peace, not from unity, but from fear. Not a perfect peace, but one held together by a single, undeniable truth. The humans had arrived, and they were not bluffing. They didn't hold parades. There were no medals, no victory broadcasts, no triumphant speeches echoing across the stars. Earth remained silent. The kind of silence that wasn't absence, but presence. The kind that lingered, that filled every war room, every council chamber, every pirate den and smuggler's hideout with a single unspoken question: what will they do next? No one knew, and that was the point. The massacre that started it all, what had once been mistaken as a simulation, a drill, had transformed the perception of humanity forever. It wasn't just that they had killed efficiently, it was how methodically, how effortlessly they had dismantled every assumption of superiority the galaxy held. Tactical doctrine was rewritten, ancient power balances shattered. The galaxy didn't sleep the same after that. Humanity didn't ask for a seat at the table. They became the table. Entire sectors realigned their defense policies to mirror Earth's protocols. Generals rewrote their training curricula using salvaged fragments from the massacre footage, though none could replicate the speed, unpredictability, or cold logic displayed. Attempts to build artificial combat intelligences based on human neural scans backfired. Machines either malfunctioned from paradox loops or developed terrifying levels of autonomy and had to be purged. Humanity wasn't a formula to copy. It was a threat to acknowledge, and still, Earth spoke nothing. Their silence became a greater force than any weapon. Empires that had once launched conquests across whole clusters now held their borders with trembling discipline. Skirmishes dried up, not because peace had been achieved, but because no one wanted to test how far the human leash extended. Stories spread, quiet warnings, entire fleets that went dark after brushing too close to Earth's unmarked zones, surveillance probes that returned with corrupted memories, shadow units that intervened in civil wars with surgical, deniable precision. The term drill response became a coded nightmare, whispered between admirals and strategists. In private, some leaders still debated whether humanity could be reasoned with, whether diplomacy might open doors, create cooperation. But Earth wasn't interested in cooperation, not out of hostility, but focus. They were building, always building. Faster-than-light comms disrupted the same week Earth launched a new constellation of black satellites, origin unknown. Trade routes shifted after entire mining colonies went silent, only to later be purchased legally by Terran front corporations. No blood, no invasion, just precision acquisition through fear and economic strangulation. This was a different kind of war, the kind that didn't need armies to win. And yet, despite all that power, Earth never struck first. They didn't expand. Like a conquering force, they didn't demand tribute or obedience. Their moves were calculated, surgical, and always retaliatory. That restraint terrified the Council more than any weapon ever could, because it meant humanity wasn't ruled by ego. They didn't lash out when insulted. They only acted when challenged. And when they did, they left nothing behind. The massacre had become the new baseline, a constant reminder of how little it took for humans to shift from observers to executioners. But it wasn't just a moment in time. It was a signal, a declaration not of war, but of capability. And the galaxy finally understood. It hadn't been a one-off display. It had been the minimum. Within human territory, the psychological shift was complete. Children studied interspecies tactics the way others once studied history. The massacre wasn't just recounted. It was deconstructed, analyzed, improved upon. Simulations became harder, faster, meaner. Failure is expensive, their instructors drilled, but underestimation is fatal. Humanity had no interest in being loved. They only demanded one thing: never be taken lightly again. Diplomatic. Envoys still visited Earth, but none left with guarantees. Trade continued, but always on Earth's terms. A dozen species offered joint military partnerships. None were accepted. Earth's logic was simple. Cooperation required trust, and the galaxy had already failed that test. They had watched the massacre unfold, thinking it was a joke, a test, a game. And in doing so, they revealed everything about how little they respected human life until it started taking theirs. A single artifact now rested beneath Earth's orbital command. A preserved section of the original simulation chamber, blackened with plasma burns and shrapnel scars. No inscription, no glorification, just the remains of a moment that changed the trajectory of civilization. Officers passed it every day. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. That weakness invites challenge. That silence can be sharper than words. That fear, when earned, is the most stable form of peace. And across the stars, that fear held. Systems that once boasted of invincibility now operated in hushed tones. Rogue factions dismantled their own fleets before Earth noticed. Even criminal syndicates began enforcing their own form of order, not out of morality, but insurance. The message was clear. If you stirred chaos, you might wake them again. And if they woke, there would be no second warnings. The massacre that began as a misunderstanding ended as doctrine. Humanity never needed to shout. They didn't crave recognition. What they had achieved was something rarer, more valuable. They had become the answer to every hypothetical, the baseline against which all future threats would be measured. A quiet, calculating force behind the scenes, holding back not out of mercy, but purpose. The galaxy would move forward, conflicts would reignite, politics would evolve. But one truth remained untouched, unchallenged, unforgotten. The humans were real. And the next time they moved, it wouldn't be a drill.